I believe I'm going to receive what God promised. I'm expecting that to be the case. So I'm trusting God. Now, but to trust God don't mean to sit down and do nothing. To trust God means to live the life that says I trust God. Now, so when you stumble and fall, Julia, when I stumble and fall, the life that trusts God is very penitent. Sorry. But more than that, folks, once we understand that and I think old Charles is hitting the nail on the head on Sunday morning in Luke. One of the main themes of the Gospel of Luke is repentance. And the word repent means to change your mind. Change your mind. So quit thinking. Quit doing that thinking. Mm-hmm. Quit thinking that, everything's okay when sin is present. It ain't okay. We've got to think the same thing about sin God does. And there's what I think the main foundation. There's where the foundation has to be laid. I have to think about my sin in the same way God thinks about my sin. And that's what confession is. To say the same thing, to speak the same. So confession of sin is to speak the same thing about that sin that God does. It's not to say, I have committed an act. No. It's to say, the act I have committed is heinous. God thinks that, and since God thinks that, I think that. And of course, that's not always true for me. You can deal with that like you want to. I've got a lot of growing to do. Now, so the assurance of things hoped for, and the what? Yeah. But the conviction is always based on evidence, and evidence is a better word, I think. The evidence of things not seen. Because without evidence, there can be no faith. You draw your conclusion. Whatever your conclusion is, you draw that conclusion based on evidence. And if you're going to believe that something not seen is real, you need some evidence. You need some evidence to believe that. Now, so we get to this place. He first gives this assurance. What does he say about faith in the men of old? Yeah, by faith, the men of old gained approval. Now, the word he uses here is not the fathers gained approval. It's the elders, older people, the ancient ones. So that's why, you can start with Abel, and because Abel was not a patriarch of Israel, folks. So he's not talking about patriarchs. He's not talking about the fathers of he's talking about the old men, the people who've lived in ancient times. And that's why I can start with Abel. And then he makes this statement. By faith we understand that the ages, not worlds, ages were prepared by the Word of God, so that what is seen was not made out of things which are visible. Now, I read one of my favorite Greek scholars, W.M.B.C, and I read several. And every time the commentators talk about this verse, they talk about God creating the universe, the stars and the moon and the sun and so forth. And folks, I don't think the stars and the sun and the moon and the planet we live on is anywhere in that verse. He's not talking about the planets and the universe. He's talking about the ages of mankind. And the Bible is consistent with that. There's no doubt about that. Notice, for an example, Acts 17, when he says, He made from one man every nation of mankind to live on the face of the earth, having determined their appointed times and the boundaries of their habitation. And I keep saying this, the ideal illustration of that, although it's not the only one in the Bible, the ideal illustration of that is Nebuchadnezzar's statue. When he says, okay, Nebuchadnezzar, you're the head of gold, and this is your time, and this is your boundary. And when you reach that boundary, your time's up. It's going to be the time for the Medes and the Persians. And here's their boundary. And when they reach their boundary, their time's up. And it's going to be the time for the Greeks. And then it's going to be the time for the Romans. And then during the days of the Roman kings, God said, I'll set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed. Spiritual, eternal. And set up don't mean begin. It means establish. It means give a foundation. Now that's just one verse. And my main verse for all this is the Colossians passage. Where Paul talks about, and let me back up and show you mine. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of all creation. That is the preeminent one of all creation. Why? Why is he preeminent or firstborn? Because by him, all things were created. What things? The things in the heavens and on the earth. The things visible and invisible. Whether, by the way, notice, visible and invisible. Whether thrones that are visible or thrones that are invisible. Whether dominions that are visible or invisible. Rulers that are visible or invisible. See, he's not talking about the planets. All things have been created for him and through him, and he is before him, and all things hold together. And then look, he is the head of the body, the church. The beginning, the firstborn from the dead, so that in him he'll come to have first place in everything. So we're not talking about dirt and water and stars and sun and moon. And it's interesting to me, by the way, I was thinking the other day, what's the song that we sing? There is for Jesus, good nature. Well, we use that. And then we say, fair is the sunlight, fairer still the moon. Wait a minute, that's not right. Why isn't it fair is the moonlight and fairer is still the sunlight? Somehow they missed that, and we sing it like, boy, isn't that great? And missed the whole point. Now, so that was my sermon. Shall we send an invitation or just go on to table? So when he says that the ages were prepared by the Word of God, he's fixing to describe what happened in those ages. Abel, Enoch, Noah, Abraham, Moses. You see the logic of that? The rationale?
So, Gerald, I really never knew about Abel had the reason he offered a sacrifice because he had faith. And then Cain didn't offer his faith.
Hello. Now, this is an argument that I've had running arguments with, that Melvin and I had running arguments with, not each other, with some folks that wanted to say, well, see there, it wasn't the fact that he offered the sacrifice that showed his faith. It wasn't the blood sacrifice. It wasn't the type of sacrifice he offered that demanded his faith. Well, I'm going to prove to y'all that it was. I'm going to prove that it was the fact that he offered a blood sacrifice. But the first thing I want to say is that we have to remember always in all situations that major premise. Faith comes by hearing. No, I can't think. Okay, let me turn this around. There's my syllogism. Now, can't have faith without hearing. Now, Cain offered his sacrifice by faith. Cain did not. That's the argument. So Cain's sacrifice of whatever he offered through to the ground, was not a sacrifice by faith. He didn't offer the correct sacrifice. He didn't trust God for God to accept the correct sacrifice. Now, that's my argument, and I'm sticking to it. But I have still more. In Hebrews chapter 12, is it? Yeah, 12:24. When the Hebrew writer sums up his argument, he says in verse 22, "You have come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, and to myriads of angels, to the general assembly and church of the firstborn enrolled in heaven, and to God, the judge of all, and the spirits of righteous men made perfect, and to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood, which speaks better than of Abel." And of course we have the blood there, which is an italicized word. But I'm going to show you something. 10 times out of 9, when we read that verse, we think about the blood that was Abel's blood, which Cain shed when he killed him. And that's not the blood he's talking about. He's talking about the blood of the sacrifice he offered. The blood of bulls and goats could never take away sin. Abel offered a blood sacrifice, and Jesus, the sacrifice of Jesus is better than the one Abel offered. And that's the point that he's making here. He's not making the point that Jesus' shed blood on the cross, literal blood, was better than the literal blood of Abel that was shed by Cain. No, he's talking about the sacrificial. So it's not Abel's literal blood, it's the blood that Abel sacrificed by killing that animal as sacrificed to God. Now, you can do with that what you want to, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. I think it's a good argument. Now, so by faith, Abel offered to God a better sacrifice than Cain, through which he obtained testimony that he was righteous, and God testifying about his gifts. And through faith, though he is dead, he still speaks. Now, it's not through faith his death still speaks. He's talking about Abel's faith in that he offered the sacrifice which God commanded. By faith he offered a better sacrifice than Cain. Now, so these brethren would argue that God wasn't talking about the sacrifice here, he was talking about the attitude. So Abel had a better attitude than Cain when he offered his sacrifice. He had a better heart, so God accepted his sacrifice. Cain's heart was no good, so he didn't accept his sacrifice. It had nothing to do with the sacrifice, it had to do with their hearts. Now, I have one more verse. And then
I want to ask a question. How do we know that Abel was supposed to offer the blood sacrifice?
Because that's what God required. Without the shedding of blood, there can be no what? See, that's the whole argument. The whole argument. See, we just argued that in chapter 9 and 10. The Hebrew writer argued that without the shedding of blood, there's no remission. He argued that with the Old Covenant and he argued with the New. Now, remember that Genesis was written to who? To the Jews, who already had the law and already understood the sacrificial system. But I think it's logic. The logic of it is faith comes by hearing. Now, so what did Abel hear? Only that he was supposed to offer a sacrifice? Well, that's what Cain heard.
Was he the first one that heard that they're supposed to have that sacrifice?
Well, I'm not sure whether he was the first one or not, but
Well, I mean, that was my
he
question
did,
was,
we know that he did.
we know he did, but I just wondered, how did he know he was supposed to do that?
And I think because the logic demands that faith comes by hearing. Therefore he heard. Therefore he did. He trusted what God said. That's why it's by faith. Now, in 1 John chapter 3, notice this. Here's the message, verse 11, which you've heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. Not as Cain. Don't love like Cain, who was of the evil one, and slew his brother. And for what reason did he slay him? Because his attitude was evil and his brother's attitude was righteous. Is that what it says? No. It says his deeds were evil. What he did was evil. And that's why he killed Abel. That's not why God accepted the sacrifice. That's why he killed Abel. He killed Abel because God accepted Abel's sacrifice and did not accept his. That's why he killed him. Abel's deeds were righteous deeds. Cain's deeds were evil deeds. And his evilness culminated, it didn't begin when he killed Abel. You see that argument? See that logic? To me, the scriptures are relatively plain.
Well, it be like he was so jealous of God.
Now he was jealous, but he had his evilness was even not jealousy. His evilness was manifested in the fact that he offered the sacrifice he offered. That was rebellion. And that's the whole argument of the Bible. No. Every passage of the Bible argues that. I don't know.
You think Cain could have
He could offer the blood sacrifice.
blood sacrifice,
Yeah.
but he didn't have it in his mind.
He did. He was going to do what he was going to do.
He had an
We don't know anybody like that today, do we? We're going to worship the way we want to worship. We're going to serve the way we want to serve.
We're going to do it because we have to.
There you go. Now, so, wow. Who would thought one little verse would have so much power? And not only so, watch him build. Who was Enoch? Who was Enoch?
And what was
Yeah, he was translated. He was taken up. He was the father of Methuselah, folks. Enoch was the father of Methuselah. My question is, what was the riddle? How do you say the riddle? Who was the man who lived longer than his father, yet died before his father died? He lived longer than his father, but he died before his father died. Enoch, because Methuselah lived 969 years. Enoch didn't die at all. but it was 300 years on the earth, you know. So by faith, Enoch was taken up so that he would not see death. And he was not found because God took him up, for he obtained the witness that before his being taken up, he was pleasing to God. And without faith, it is impossible to please him, for he that comes to God must believe that he is, and that he is a rewarder of those who seek him. Now, what I want you to see specifically, besides the illustration of Enoch, is that verse 5 and 6 go together. The logic of 5 and 6 go together. He obtained a witness that he was pleasing to God. Now, if he was pleasing to God, guess what he had to have? Faith. Because without faith, it's impossible to please him. See, that's all part of the same argument. Do you see that logic? So don't quote verse 6, just as a proof text. When you go back to Genesis chapter, is it 5? We have the story here in just 5 little verses. Verse 21. Genesis 5:21. Enoch lived 65 years and became the father of Methuselah. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years after he became the father of Methuselah, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Now that's all we're told. That's it. That's the history of Enoch. And when we come to chapter 11, we have a reference to Enoch. And then, by the way, the other reference to Enoch in the New Testament is if this is the same Enoch, in Jude, where did it say that? Is it Jude? Yeah, verse 14. And it seems to be him, because the 7th generation from Adam, it was about these men that Enoch in the 7th generation from Adam prophesied, saying, behold, the Lord came with thousands of his holy ones. So guess what Enoch was? Yeah, a prophet. We're not told that in the Old Testament. We would know that unless we read Jude.
If Enoch had a son, he had to have a wife.
Yeah.
They don't never say nothing about the wife.
Yeah, because ultimately he's talking about the genealogy of the seed line, the seed from Jesus. Every now and then they'll say something about the women if they were bad.
I know. Deborah wasn't bad.
Yeah, but that wasn't a wife.
Yeah, that wasn't the one.
I mean, when he mentions her, he don't mention her as a wife. He mentions her as a judge. But in the genealogy of Jesus, who's there? Tamar, Rahab.
All the heart.
Anyway, I rest my case.
I'm on good.
Hey, brother, I need to shut up. They outnumber us. Okay, so back to Enoch. So the point is, how do we know Enoch had faith? Yeah, but basically because he pleased God. God tells us he pleased him. Yeah, you can't please God without having faith. See, that's the argument of verse 6. You cannot please God without being a person of faith. Now, interestingly enough, then notice the logic of the Hebrew writer's argument when he says you have need of endurance, you have need of patience, so that when you have maintained your faith in God, you'll receive the reward. And of course, I think the reward he's dealing with, of course, is the establishment of the kingdom, which was AD 70. The judgment that was against the Jewish nation and the ultimate establishment of the kingdom. But I have a sermon thing to say, and I always say this, but Tex Stevens was a preacher here at LINDALE when I first came to Thursday night classes. And so I came over here one Sunday to hear Tex preach, and Tex preached a sermon on Enoch. And he used this phrase right here. What does this phrase right here imply? What does that phrase imply? I'm sorry? My emphasis,
Oh, okay.
he was what?
Okay. Not found.
What does that imply?
Couldn't find him.
They looked for him.
Yeah.
The implication is they looked for him.
No stone.
Listen, if somebody goes missing, what do?
Go look for 'em.
We look for him. You know, I mean, in our day, you know, we had a thing recently where the young woman was taken out of her car, you know, and the baby was left in the car, and everything on the TV was looking for her. Of course, they finally found her dead body, you know. But that's what we think, you know. Where'd he go? He's somewhere around. We'll find him. Guess what they couldn't do? They couldn't find him. Why? Because he wasn't there. He was taken up. Now, we have another story in the Bible of somebody who was translated who didn't see death. Who was it? Elijah. Because Elisha took Elijah's place. And you remember the story, and I'm just going to tell it. You know, Elijah says, okay, Elisha, you stay over here. I'm going across the river. And Elisha said, I ain't staying here. And so Elijah said, what do you want? And he said, I want a double portion of the spirit of Elijah. A double portion. And Elijah said, well, if you see me when I'm taken up, you'll get it. And so he did. He saw him when he was taken up. And so he goes back to the river. Remember when they first crossed the river, Elijah took his mantle and hit it on the water, and they crossed on dry land. And when Elisha comes back, he takes Elijah's mantle, which is now his, and hits the river, and he walks across on dry land. And he gets back over there, and the people say, where's Elijah? And Elisha said, well, he's gone. And listen to what they said, and you can go read it. They said, we have 50 strong men that we're going to send over there to look for him.
Yeah.
We have 50 strong men. Now, I don't know about you, but why do they need strong men? Yeah, because they're not going to leave a stone unturned. They got to look for him. They got to move everything and find him. And guess what? He wasn't found. Now, and that's an interesting story. 2 people, but it says about him, about Enoch, he was not found because God took him. And
Gerald, that's why it's so easy to think about helping in a place. Because every time they talk about God taking somebody, it's up. And it's just like when they saw Jesus, he went up into, you know, so you always think,
Isn't it up? Can't they up?
Huh?
Where is it? It's not up.
it's right here.
It's right here.
It's right here.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. That's why people think, because that's why a lot of like,
Well-
they picture the 3 heavens up.
Yeah. But again, remember we're dealing with figurative language.
And if you didn't know that, that's what I'm saying. That's
Because-
where you got that from.
Because what kind of figure would it be, you know, if you was standing there on the dirt and all of a sudden you just started going down through the dirt?
Oh, quicksand.
What kind of figure would that be? What kind of picture would that paint in your mind? I don't know, my mind just works in mysterious ways.
That's interesting. Ooh, he's in quicksand.
Who told him there for he obtained the witness that before he was being taken up?
Yeah, he was pleased as a God.
Yeah, I know, but who's the witness? There is. For he obtained the witness?
Okay, let's see. Who testified about Abel's gifts?
God testified about it.
So who testified about Enoch's faith? That's what witness is. And how did he do it? He took him up. He told everybody in the world for all times that Enoch was a man of faith. God's testimony is terribly plain, powerfully plain. Does that make sense? And that's the point. Who's giving witness to the faith of these men, folks? God is. Every one of them. My faith Abel, my faith Enoch, my faith Noah, which we come to. See, that's what this point is. The point is, you have need of endurance. You must learn to. You say you have trusted God through Jesus. What's your life? Now, see, the sad thing about it is, see, we argue negatively. I'm going to preach a minute now. Listen to me. Because when people see us not living lives of faith, what do they call us? Why? Because we say we have faith, and then we act differently. You see, you can't. That's inconsistent. If you have faith, live. If you're not going to live, shut up. Because the trusting of the sacrifice of Jesus is not just for. See, that's why I keep pounding this thing. God did not put Jesus on the cross merely, uniquely, only to be able to forgive sins, which is what we've preached. And that's what we've taught. And we glory in our remission of sins instead of glorying in the fact that we have remission of sins so we can be in a new covenant relationship with God. We have fellowship with God. And we major on the wrong emphasis. We put the wrong emphasis on the wrong syllable. Remission of sins is terribly, terribly important. Wonderfully important. But it's not the end that God was looking for. The end that He was looking for was fellowship with us. And if we're going to say we have fellowship with God, how are we supposed to walk? John says, this is the message we've heard from Him and announced to you, that God is light and in Him is no darkness at all. If we say we have fellowship with Him and walk in the darkness, we're lying. So that to be saved by faith, God's righteousness is a faith righteousness. What we're saying is that we trust that sacrifice, but we trust God. God counts us righteous. And so we really believe God wants to have fellowship with us. We really believe that our life is supposed to be a life lived with God. We really believe that. Abel really believed that. Enoch really believed that. Noah really believed that. See, that's the point of the chapter.
So is the covenant also with our relationship with each other? The covenant with you also?
Well, it's that covenant, because ultimately, if you're going to have fellowship with God, guess what you can't got to do? You have to have fellowship with those who are in fellowship with God. So if you're not in fellowship with those who are in fellowship with God, guess what you're not in?
Fellowship with God.
So that's the
What's He do? He points up.
break it down and bring it both together.
Yes, ma'am.
So they got a new covenant with each other.
That's right. Yeah. The covenant with God has to be a covenant with each other as well. Or covenant that involves each other. Now, so we get this other one verse that's a powerful verse. And we'll stop here. We're going to talk with Abraham next week. I'm sorry, y'all. I just preached on it. But by faith, Noah, being warned by God about things not yet seen. What was the things not yet seen? Yeah, but the things that had not been seen when Noah.
Oh, okay.
The water.
The flood, the water.
Yeah.
God warned him, I'm going to destroy the world with water.
Yeah.
That had never happened before. never, there's no history. See, what do people say when we start arguing about facts, you know, the history and so forth? Well, wait a minute. Look at Matthew 24. That never has literally happened. And so it hasn't literally happened, it must be somewhere in our future. You see, if something hasn't, see, that's the way we argue, isn't it? That's the way we look at things. And so, no flood, that's never happened. And why do you think the people laughed at Noah when he preached to them about the coming judgment, coming flood? Oh, Noah, that's never happened before, and it's never going to happen.
That's what it did.
And it did, yeah, it did. The history. See, that's why people have to argue against the cataclysmic. You know, people say, well, there was really no flood. There was really no flood. Well, there was a flood. And by the way, and Jesus used the flood of Noah to say, and there was a judgment against that world, and there's fixed to be a judgment against the Jewish world. He used that as an illustration to say, don't forget. Now, so being warned by God about things not seen him yet, and reverence, that's an interesting statement, you know, why not in faith? Preparing an ark for the salvation of his household, by which he condemned the world, and became an heir of the righteousness, which is according to faith. Now, we understand the building of the flood, and we go read 6, 7, and 8 of Genesis 9. But, you know, we have those 4 little chapters. Every thought and imagination of man's heart was only evil continually, so God said, I'm going to bring a flood, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. I don't want to rehash that history because you know it so well, but what I do want to do is make an argument. And 1 Peter 3, and I'll say this quick. Our brethren will say, okay, folks, Noah was saved in the ark, and we're saved in the church. And they'll quote this verse. Verse, actually 3:20. When he talks about those spirits in Britain who were woken and here's the argument. When the patience of God kept waiting in the days of Noah, during the construction of the ark, in which a few, that is 8 persons, were brought safely through the water. Now, King James said saved by water, but, okay. Now, what is the point of verse 20? That they were saved by the ark or they were saved by the water? No.
By the water?
They were saved by the water. How were they saved by the water? Well, the water floated the ark up on top and everybody else drowned.
Okay, I see it now.
The argument Peter makes is they were saved by water. What's his point? Corresponding to that, the church now saves you. Oh, not the church? Then why are we arguing? Verse 20 says the church saves us, but we argue 21 says baptism saves us. What a terrible what terrible logic. What ignorance. And I don't use that word, you know, to malign. I'm using it in the truest sense of the word. Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And that's right, yeah, and they still do. And folks, you know, J.D. Harris he'd come to me when he was going to preach that sermon. He was going to preach that sermon to the prisoners, you know, the prisoners. And he comes in there one morning, he starts out, I said, J.D., let me ask you a few questions. Where is the church in any of this? context. Where does Peter mention the church? Never mentions it one time. But we do, because we want to put it in there. We don't get it out of it, we want to put it in it. And so we tell our story about they were saved by the ark, but hey, that verse don't say they were saved by the ark. That verse says they were saved by the water. And the illustration is, and just like that, just like they were saved by water, baptism now saves you. So baptism has to do with water. Now, do with that what you want to. But bless our hearts, we sure abuse, for people who say historically, we're going to speak where the Bible speaks and be silent where the Bible's silent. We do a lot of talking where we ought not to, and we keep our mouths shut where we ought to be saying a bunch.
Gerald, when you first started, did you see that at first when you first started studying? Did you see it that way the first time you?
When I studied, yeah, first time I studied it, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, did I preach it that way?
Yeah,
No.
that's what
Why?
I'm saying. Did you preach it the way they?
I preached it the way they preached
Yeah.
it. Not because I studied the Bible, because I just trusted those old preachers.
Yeah.
You know?
Okay. Yeah.
Let me go get my sermon outlines and start preaching the sermon outlines. And, that's why I keep saying, my first full-time preaching job was in Cuero, Texas, and it lasted about 17 months, because that's all the persecution those people could take. I beat them over the head and persecuted them for 17 months. Because that's what I was taught. That's the way I was taught. I was as legalistic a person as you've ever seen in your life. Finally, I even had a guy tell me, Gerald, why are you always beating up on us? So, that's who I was. It ain't who I am now, thank God. Let's see, what was the story? What's that little line? I'm not as good as the other guy. Anyway, that's good. But thank God I'm not what I used to be. That's the moral of that story. Thank God I'm not what I used to be. So Noah built the ark by faith. What does that say, by the way? Faith comes by hearing. God told me. Now, folks, we preached that about Noah. And I'm going to tell you what. I'm going to tell you what else. These people who will make their argument about it being Abel's attitude and not Abel's sacrifice, they will use that argument just like we do. They'll leave it out here, but use it here. Well, that's consistent. So God told him. Now, and so logically, folks, listen to me now. Logically, Noah built the ark to the specifications that God said. You make it, 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 50 cubits high. And Noah made it just like God told him to. Pitch it within and without. Now, so God, if Noah trusted him, what if Noah had said, well, let me make it about 200 cubits long. Save me a little work. Where would faith be in that? See? If you trust God here, you trust God with your life. That's where we need to be putting the emphasis, see. We need to be putting the emphasis. Jesus came to show us how God intended for us to live.
And aren't we thankful?
Now, if God intended us to live that way, then how should we be trying to live?
That way.
See, ultimately, he came to show us how God intended for us to live, but he died on the cross so God could forgive us for not living that way and allow us to have fellowship with him. Does that mean God don't want us to live that way anymore? Not at all. Not at all. Okay, we're going to stop there with verse 7. Start with Abraham next week. Just for the